So thank you for joining today's the Source Defense webinar about PCI eSkimming controls in practice. As you saw in some of the materials that we sent out, the goal of today's session is kind of to update folks on what we've seen over the last 16 months or so about eSkimming controls out in the world. So kind of like what's happening with attacks, what's changing about attacks. How are the eSkimming requirements in PCI DSS holding up against contemporary eSkimming malfeasance? And what do we need to do to make our websites practically secure moving forward while also being compliant? Source defense has been in this space for quite a long time. We've recently partnered with MasterCard. They've selected us kind of as their vendor of choice in this space where we're working with them closely on a number of initiatives. And the goal of Source Defense as an organization is really to protect data at what we call the point of capture. So we've always been in this space. It's all we do. And the problem is a little bit broader than just eSkimming. It's that web pages don't have security in them. That's what we were founded to solve, and that's what we've been doing for a long time. The other idea here is, of course, that filters into a bunch of different areas of cybersecurity practice, things like risk management, things like vendor assessment, things like zero trust and software bill of materials. It's all kind of in that universe. We also, as I mentioned, as a result, map up very cleanly onto compliance concerns. So solving the underlying problem is also going to make you compliant in a bunch of different areas. PCI DSS, of course, kind of the focus of what we're talking about today, but there are basically endless other applications of this across a compliance landscape. HIPAA these days is getting a lot of attention. Many different organizations being the target of class action suits because of tools like the Metapixel being installed on their web pages. GDPR has always been of interest in this context because, well, I mean, the first and most, I think it's still the harshest fine levied under GDPR was against British Airways because of an e-skimming attack that took place on their website. Financial institutions, or rather kind of establishments, organizations like FFIEC and others have taken notice of this. CCPA, CPRA, some of the more regional stuff. Long story short, lots of great reasons to solve for e-skimming, no matter your industry or your kind of area of expertise. The basic idea, like I mentioned, is that a dramatic amount of code inside of a modern web page has no security controls within it, and that the majority of that code is delivered from other parts outside the control of an organization. And this is a little bit different than a kind of, let's say, hardware-based supply chain attack, or even some other supply chain attacks like Log4j or SolarWinds, where it's kind of something that's deployed inside the organization and then it's poisoned and some other stuff. This has much more to do with the dynamic nature of web page code, how it is managed within an organization, like people being able to add it very easily, and then the code being able to add other code during the life cycle of the web page. It represents a pretty unique challenge from a cybersecurity standpoint. Unmanaged scripts are very dangerous, meaning if you choose or have not been protecting your web pages according to DSS 643 and 1161. Unmanaged scripts can do basically whatever any other script can do. It can really take advantage of any kind of interactivity or capability that the web page has through the web browser. It can open connections to other parts of the internet. It can change what the page looks like. It can inject its own content, and of course, it can read the stuff that a visitor is typing into the web page, card data, right? It can skim it right off there and steal it. So the options are limitless for an attacker once they get in there and they start doing stuff. And I would also mention at this point that we talk about attacks, we talk about e-skimming, we talk about hackers and stuff. Also consider that even totally legitimately acting tools, like a Google Analytics or a Metapixel, even if they're not compromised or et cetera, they can and often do harvest up an immense amount of visitor information. I mean, we're all kind of used to at this point being tracked everywhere on the internet, but also consider that a marketing tool like Google Analytics can access every form field on a web page. And can record that information if it sees fit, not in a kind of like crazy conspiracy kind of way, but in a like it's misconfigured by someone in marketing and it just happens to vacuum up everything on a page. It's placed somewhere it shouldn't be. That's the healthcare example. You put Metapixel on a Find a Doctor webpage, and it kind of vacuums up everything that someone types into that form. I need an orthopedic surgeon, and I'm in this zip code. It vacuums that stuff up because that's what it's supposed to do. And then guess what? You've got a medical record that is breached and is out in the wild and is a compliance problem. In DSS, there are a handful of specific things that an organization must do if they're in scope. You're seeing them on the screen here. The requirement numbers are 643 and 1161. And I'm going to assume a little bit that if you're joining us today, you have at least some familiarity with these. So I'm not going to like drill super deep into them. The goal is kind of give more of a current state of play today. But suffice it to say, there's like kind of four verbs in this, four actions you have to take. You got to inventory scripts on payment pages. You have to make sure they're authorized and justified, like you have a written reason for them to be there. You have to assure the integrity of those payment page scripts, and then you have to monitor what are called the security headers, the HTTP response headers, to be technical about it. Also, I think kind of implicit in those other things is that you have to alert and respond to malicious scripts on payment pages. So those are the kind of guiding principles that we have now been mandated to do on payment pages. And I want to talk a little bit about how those have kind of played out in reality and some of the knock-on effects of it. So I did a study, I mean, Source Defense did, I was certainly involved, but we did a study of about 10,000 sites and we scanned across them and tried to figure out how all these requirements are being adopted. And what we found was that very poorly was the general answer. Of those 10,000 sites, about 95% had no security controls whatsoever. That would include things like content security policy that was misconfigured. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Next was reporting only, where someone has implemented CSP, but it's in a monitoring only mode. So it just kind of says if something goes wrong, it doesn't actually try to do anything about it. And then a vanishingly small 1.7% did actually have some kind of security in place that seemed somewhat effective. So the requirements, although they do have a very significant kind of enforcement behind them, you can, in the most extreme case, lose the ability to process credit cards if you experience a breach and aren't complying with DSS. So even though there's some real enforcement behind this stuff, I think what this indicates, what the data you're seeing on the screen indicates, is that people maybe want to solve the problem or are trying to solve the problem, but are being ineffective in doing so. And then the second consideration is that if they are trying to do it, they may be doing it in a way that is actually not making their website secure. So that's the misconfigured content security policy or monitoring only content security policy. And by the way, if anyone has questions or comments or really anything else, just throw it in the chat. I keep an eye on that as I'm talking. So if you want, we can be kind of interactive. I would welcome anyone to chime in as they see fit. So not great that the compliance requirements are out there, but are not being super effective in what they're trying to do. In the other thing we like to talk about in these, and I'll continue this theme throughout, is that the DSS is concerned, perhaps rightly so, with payment pages and the idea of the web page where a form is presented, whether it's an iframe or a native form or something else, that page where the card data is entered. And that's kind of the scope they define. But when we look in reality at what's happening, we are not finding that the payment pages are where the attacks are happening. As you can see here, this quote from Security Metrics, 100% of the cases that they observed where card data was skimmed, the security failure was present in the page before the payment page, or because there was a malicious script somewhere else. So even if in these cases, if the merchant had implemented a security control on the payment page, that would not have thwarted the attack. So this has been kind of a long-standing sticking point for me, at least philosophically. Source Defense, like I said, has been doing this for almost 10 years. And we've had customers for that whole duration. And the goal for us has always been to get the entire site secure, every page on a web page, because the problem is the same everywhere. and an attacker can add their own payment form or et cetera. But the DSS has somewhat at least kind of in people's minds narrowed the problem just to the payment page, and that's false in my opinion. That's not going to actually take care of the problem. As we look back to 2025 and review, and I am going to speak about some specific things in here, but it's a little bit difficult to cite like a particular attack or a particular this, just because they don't have like very catchy names like they have in the past. Like MageCart was really easy to remember, at least if you're in this niche of cybersecurity. But unfortunately, not a lot of good branding these days with the MageCart attacks. So I'm going to talk about specific things, but if you want a lot of detail on this, I'm very proud of the research work that we've done over the last year plus. Some of my colleagues worked very, very hard to do a lot of research on this stuff. And we've published that all for free to the public on our website. And we'll drop the link in the chat here. But basically, if you want more detail on anything I'm going to talk about, you can find it published in long form on our site with lots of specific examples. Yeah, and there it is in the chat right now. So, e-skimming attacks are proliferating and are becoming more sophisticated. This is not kind of I don't know, a curiosity for attackers. They have learned that this is a vital way to sustain their operations to get money out of stolen credit cards. So they're going to keep doing it. And then the attacks are getting more and more sophisticated. So just like they're seeing it's profitable, they also kind of, I'll show you, they also kind of are making it more efficient for themselves to do it. Attacks are evolving to evade controls. So recently I was involved in some forensic work, and what we see is that when an infection is in a site, when a site is compromised by an e-skimming attack, the attack changes dynamically based on the security controls in place and kind of even in an adversarial fashion, meaning that the site owner turns on one kind of security, and so the attack pivots to do something different and get around that. And so you get a kind of game of spy versus spy or something like that. Compliance, like I touched on a moment ago, maybe leaving folks with a false sense of security. You're following the rules. Everything has to be fine, right? But then in practice, that is not the case, and you still fall victim to an e-skimming attack. Additional forms of data theft. So as I mentioned, if anywhere on a website where data, sensitive data or otherwise, is entered into the web page, is a great place for the attacker to try to get to and try to steal information. And they're kind of doing a, well, while we're here sort of approach. Like if I'm the attacker and I'm in the web pages and I'm there to steal card numbers, why not grab some passwords and why not grab some biographical information or so on and so forth while I'm there? They do persist still for a very, very long period of time. At the beginning, like 10 years ago, you would see dwell times, meaning time between infection and discovery or remediation of like 10, 11, 12 years. I'm sorry, that's wrong. Of like 3, 4, 5 years, still a long time, but not decades. More recently, we've started seeing that still happen, even though this attack is more well known, but still like a year or more. And then reinfection is still really, really long, really, really common where something's cleaned up, but then it comes back later. So unfortunately, despite the additional scrutiny and additional compliance, we are not really seeing things improve in this space. The takeaways we've seen just in this last quarter, or excuse me, yeah, this prior quarter, more and more first-party scripts are being abused. So that both means code inside of the web app proper, like something that an organization would write themselves, but also kind of trusted partners. Things like Google Tag Manager or others are being used more prominently. Silent skimming remains very, very popular. What that means is that the attack code just kind of skims, just kind of silently records what someone's typing into the web page. As you can probably guess, that's a good way to do it and a very easy way to stay unknown, stay incognito. The next thing we see most prevalently is exact spoofing of a payment page. This meaning that the attacker will replace a legitimate payment form with their own malicious version of it to steal card numbers and then return control to the page. And I think the biggest difference here is generative AI. If anyone had a bet on how long it took in this webinar to hear the word AI, I think it was about 15 minutes. But more seriously, attackers take advantage of tools that we all use now to say, they can basically say, hey, look at this website and make me a payment form that looks exactly like this, but sends data to somewhere else, evil on the internet. The prevalence, or I guess the commonness of these attacks, it has maintained and increased thousands of sites, tens of thousands of sites per year. It's the full spectrum of size and sophistication. So we do see very, very large brands, like a bunch of automakers, very, very recently were victimized by this attack. We also see, of course, huge swaths of e-commerce sites that fall on the more modest size as well. And then CSP bypass is a common theme. So I guess I haven't really defined this. Content security policy is one technology that you can use to secure a web page or attempt to do so. It is recommended by the DSS. There's basically three recommendations, or I guess it's guidance, excuse me, in DSS to solve eSkimming attacks. It is content security policy, sub-resource integrity, or a vendor-based solution. And so CSP bypass is kind of a, I don't know, a sport almost for attackers. It's very simple for them to bypass content security policy. And also, we've seen in live attacks, attackers adding, like whitelisting their own scripts through CSP. So not just getting around it, but using it to legitimize their access to the page and let it be persistent. And then I've said this a couple times, but just being on the payment page, just being concerned with that is not sufficient to take care of things. I want to thank you. We just dropped another link in the chat that talks about the different approaches. This is from the yeah, it's an ebook that we provided. It's got some more information on CSP and SRI, and we'll give you some more details on what those approaches might bear for you. Tens of thousands of e-commerce sites were attacked. Every type of business remains vulnerable to this, so no change there. 92 distinct, no change from prior years and from the past decade or so. Everything's up for up for grabs. Bunch of different campaigns. 30 plus different Google Tag Manager containers compromised. There's a lot of jargon in that. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, but think of that more like 30 distinct, easily loadable toolkits that can show up on any web page that attackers have developed and are in the wild now. And then modular attack infrastructure has become more prevalent as well. This meaning that code gets inside a web page and then kind of selectively loads different techniques to decide how to manipulate the page and be successful in their attack. We see more scale in these things, thousands of sites hit in a single campaign. So one set of attackers deciding to steal a bunch of card numbers are going after larger swaths. And then that kind of like customization, or let's say, tailoring, we see much more prominently as well. So I think this is also attributable to generative AI, meaning that if I want a fraudulent credit card form and I want that in Turkish, that is dramatically easier for me to do than it was a long time ago. And then payment platforms don't help one way or the other with this. Every major payment platform in PSP, I'm not saying it's been compromised, I'm not throwing that kind of shade, but there's not like, oh, if you install this PSP solution on your pages, you are guaranteed to not have e-skimming attacks. It doesn't really matter. Everybody who's got payment service providers on their payment pages, irrespective of which one, can fall victim the same way. The past 3 months have been very busy. One of note was 2,000 attacks in a single, that was last week. Actually, that may have been 2 weeks ago, based on when these slides were prepared. That was a bunch of different large targets, a bank, supermarket chain, and lots of small merchants. These were advanced persistent threat style attacks. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say this is necessarily like a state acting group or et cetera. What I think I mean by this is that they were active in the sites after the code got in there. It wasn't just kind of fire and forget and see what shows up in the net. They hung out, they made decisions, they changed what they were doing to respond to security. Reinfection remains gigantic, and it was a blend in this campaign of first and third party services, meaning both code that was served from the website itself and code that was included from other parts of the internet on the fly. Moving forward. CSP weaponization, like I mentioned, this has been a big deal where attackers are actually modifying the content security policy of a web page to make sure that their code loads. They will often also rip out protection that was in the CSP to prevent other code from loading, meaning that they broaden their options once they're in there. The other thing about this is that they take advantage of things like Google Tag Manager or other legitimate services that can add code themselves to the web page. Those tools need to be permitted in order to function by CSP. You need to whitelist those with CSP if you want Google Tag Manager to work. And as a result, attackers know about that, so it's kind of an open door for them to walk through. There's no way for you to both run Google Tag Manager and to have a secure CSP implementation, in my opinion. The problem, in our opinion, and this does get a little opinionated, but that DSS is leading people somewhat astray with what they're doing, that it kind of misunderstands the threat to be something that's contained only to a payment page, and that it doesn't, when you recommend something like a CSP policy or a CSP as a solution, it provides a false sense of security. It hasn't really, if anyone on the phone is I assume, is pretty hooked into DSS and to compliance, it takes them an extremely long time to go from like idea to published rules and then actually enforce published rules. And so something to consider, like there's unfortunately, because of just institutional burden, it's going to take them a while to adapt. As you can see over the last few slides, this stuff continues to evolve. And so the rules need to catch up, and that might take a while. Moving forward is that I think overall the community needs to consider in and of itself what they're trying to do to secure things, because ultimately it's our websites that are going to be compromised and are going to be harmed, and also the visitors and the card numbers. And then I mean, like at the end of the day, unfortunately, it's the merchant who's going to get kind of leaned on if their card numbers are stolen, whether they were compliant or not. Um, let's see. I have a bad habit of kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, so I want to make sure I'm not repeating too very much in here. CSP and SRI. Let's get down to the heart of some of these specific things we saw in 2025, 2026. Google Tag Manager is becoming very popular with attackers. So if anyone's not familiar, let me just define a couple of terms here, just so it's clear. So a tag, by the way, is equivalent to script. It means the same thing. It means the same thing as JavaScript. It means the same thing as web page code. So tag just means script. The Google Tag Manager then is a piece of software that Google provides. There are other things like this in the world too, by the way. Telium is one. There's some others, but Google provides this one. And what you do is you embed this tool inside your web pages. Google Tag Manager itself is a JavaScript file. And then what that lets you do is very easily add other JavaScript to the web page. This is basically a tool that was invented a long time ago to make it simple for, let's say, a marketing person to add new JavaScript stuff to a web page without needing to involve a developer. So you can imagine that at one point, I guess basically it played out like this in prehistory. Some marketing department kept saying over and over again, I need you to update this JavaScript. I need you to change this thing. We onboard this new vendor, integrate this. And then finally some developer said, I don't want to do this anymore. Let's create a tool that goes in between and makes it very easy for that non-technical user to add new code to our web pages dynamically. So that's what it does. It's extremely common. I mean, it's like I would say it's on at least 90% of the websites that I look at professionally in my professional life, and just generally, it's extremely common. And what's cool about this for attackers is when they're running an eSkimming attack, they can basically just use the GTM install in the web page to launch their own attack. So the way Google Tag Manager works is you kind of have this idea of a container that just means a set of scripts. And so the page gets instructed, says GTM says, hey, load all these scripts from this container and run them. Cool. That could be the whole marketing toolkit that's supposed to be in the web page. What attackers do and say, hey, while you're at it, load one of my containers too, because it has all my eSkimming tools and all the cool stuff, the modularization, all the fancy things we were talking about before. While you're loading containers, go ahead and grab mine too and load all that code. And that does two things at least. One is it's like really efficient for the attacker. They don't have to repeat anything. So from a straight up like ROI, like return on investment on their time, that's really cool that way. The second thing it does is because they're loading a bunch of scripts via the tag manager, they kind of get to ride along with some of Google's kind of domain reputation stuff and whitelist and content security policy and whatever. So this is basically a way for an attacker to act like Google in terms of privilege to the web page, and then have their code executed with the equivalent amount of privilege. So that really works very nicely for attackers, as you can imagine, just in like how they do their business. We do see and have seen an increase in this. And we have some ongoing. Scott, my producer, is doing a great job. Ongoing, there's going to be links to basically what I'm talking about in the chat. So if you want more detail on this stuff, we've got a lot of material we prepared. So keep an eye on the chat. There's going to be cool follow-ups there. We see that site-wide is a problem. That it is not sufficient if you're trying to actually solve the security problem to focus just on the payment pages. We did some research with Verizon just a little while ago, and we also worked with Coalfire on this same topic. The Verizon research was more quantitative, meaning that we looked at about 7,000 merchant sites. We saw 77,000 scripts running on non-payment pages, which means a massive attack surface. So if any of those scripts are compromised, the vendors get hacked into, GTM is loading stuff, all those good things. There's 77,000 points of entry across those 7,000 sites. And again, on non-payment pages. So that's the idea. And Visa themselves said that non-payment infrastructure is the first step. And I guess one more, just to go back for a second. GTM, when it's deployed, is almost always deployed across an entire website. I can't think of a single instance where GTM would only be deployed on a payment page. So from an attacker standpoint, you get everything in one whack with that. Iframes don't stop this. I would assume at this point this is probably old hat to folks on the phone, but the idea is that attackers will simply replace the forms on the page with their own, rather than rely on skimming. There's kind of two things that you'll see here. Like I mentioned before, silent skimming is still and will continue to be a great way to do this if you're an attacker, where they just kind of tell the web page, hey, send me any keystrokes that are typed in to the browser, or send me the contents of any form field and that kind of stuff. And that's sent out, and there's a bunch of kind of fancy footwork in between about encryption and everything else. But the basic idea is that they just say, hey, web page, tell me what gets typed in, and the web page is more than happy to do that. The point here is that if you're looking only for kind of like the web page being broken, or you're doing kind of like a scanning sort of thing where you're comparing known good content with other content, obviously you can't see what you can't see, to put it weirdly. The other thing that we see very commonly is that the attackers will add their own stuff to the web page. They'll inject a new payment option, as we're calling it here, and then kind of move the visitor through an artificial and malicious payment flow. We're calling it the pizza method here because it kind of gets built along the way. And so this is a little bit more. There's one other thing that I should kind of step back and talk a little bit about, which is a double entry attack. And I've hinted at it a couple of times. A double entry attack basically is where you have a payment form on your web page, perhaps served via an iframe, and the attacker, knowing that they can't break into this iframe, what they will do instead is put their own malicious form directly on top of that other payment form. So let's see how well I can illustrate this. So behind, although without this separation, just totally on top of obscuring the legitimate payment form will be the attacker's form. The visitor looks legit to the visitor. They'll type in their information and then they'll click the button and the attacker will say, nope, that transaction failed. Then the attacker erases their form, puts the legitimate form back on the page. Then the visitor can enter their stuff again and then buy their thing, and then they get their product. Also, the attacker has stolen that card along the way with that first malicious form. So the pizza method then is that, but kind of it went to college. It got a graduate degree in stealing credit card numbers. What they'll do now is add a fake payment form. They will then force the visitor onto another web page altogether. They'll kind of just punt them over to another web application. They then will do some other stuff to capture payment details. They'll also do things at this point like verify the card number and some other things. So kind of just some, housekeeping before they steal the card number, and then they'll send them back to the merchant. So this is kind of like the double entry attack, but with way more sophistication in the middle and way more opportunity to get around things like hosted payment field solutions, or like needing to provide some kind of authentication to a payment API endpoint or a bunch of other stuff. But the point is that this is a great example of Well, I guess I would call like professionalization of a mage card attack of a client side or e-skimming attack. What I mean by that is not just kind of like, hey, check it out, we can record the keystrokes, but more like, hey, check it out, we set up in a complex delivery and like service management platform for stealing card numbers. So it's not ideal. Let's see, where do I want to head after this? Let's talk about what we see as kind of a good way to do this. I think that it would be best, everyone would be best served to look at whether your solution that you're considering, or maybe that you have in place, or et cetera, for e-skimming solutions, are you compliant or are you actually secure? And then are you compliant or are you ready for an assessment, right, for your audit? So sometimes these solutions to e-skimming attacks, or I guess basically sometimes this gets globbed in with something like an automated scan, an ASV scan, or some other kind of point in time assessment, meaning that you're thinking kind of like, well, I'm going to get an audit, or I'm sorry, I'm going to get a look into my website. I'm going to generate some materials. I'm going to understand where the gaps are. We'll fix them, and then that'll be the thing. These require lots of 643 and 1161 require lots of active upkeep, meaning that you have to at least every 7 days do a bunch of stuff. You have to be, in my opinion, you need to have some kind of real-time continuous control, and you need some way to prove that that's been in place and have the adequate reporting from it over time to prove that it's been a continuous control. So compliant, secure, and then also ready for an assessment with appropriate evidence are three different things. And that, considering just the words in DSS in a vacuum may not give all that. CSP, if you're pursuing CSP and SRI, sub-resource integrity is just kind of a hashing approach to check file contents. I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but CSP and SRI are common kinds of like DIY solutions, meaning, imagining you're a compliance officer, you say, hey, we need to be compliant with these things. The dev team comes back and says, great, we'll implement CSP and SRI. It'll take a week and then we'll be all set. Those traditionally turn into kind of black holes in terms of effort and project success, like delivery success. And so consider that the compliance rules here may not be doing the best job of steering you into a successful compliance e-skimming project. Let's put it that way. Real-time inventory and these other things are what a QSA probably would expect to see in assessment materials. So while it's important when you're evaluating solutions to consider the effectiveness of the tool and that it should actually stop e-skimming attacks, you should also consider these sorts of things in an operational sense, like does it do a good job of proving over time that scripts haven't been tampered with, or making sure that the evidence production is repeatable and straightforward. Those are very useful and important. What we think that has happened over the last year is that assessors and DSS and others have been appropriately, I don't want to overplay this. What I'm trying to get is like, I think people have been given a lot of leeway about like this was the first year that anybody had to do this authoritatively. Assessors were very happy to see solutions in place, period, like that they were in place, and that the scrutiny around the solutions as we move forward is going to become much more significant. Meaning that not just, oh yeah, okay, you did something about 643 and 1161, but that you need to continue doing that thing and operationalize it and make it a true part of your security program, rather than, yes, you got, this is the first year you got there, we started our journey. Now we're definitely continuing our journey. And that from the source defense standpoint, we do, I mean, not to be weird about it, but we do feel that our approach is a very good way to do it. And our basic idea is that we want to have a much more granular control over things than simply, inventorying scripts and then alerting if the script has changed or something like that. The goal for practical and effective security, as well as like, maintainable operations around this, should be a behavior-based approach. And by the way, that white paper we linked out before, the cold fire one, as well as a lot of the other materials, have good information on this behavior-based approach. What we mean by this is we want to tell you what is happening inside your web pages, not just like what's there and where it came from, but is card numbers, are card numbers being accessed? Is personal information being accessed? Are scripts talking to weird parts of the internet at that kind of human digestible level? That's very important in our opinion to an operational solution. Also, that just detection or just external scanning aren't going to do very much at all to solve this problem. That it must have an enforcement mechanism, and that enforcement mechanism needs to be more robust than block a script if it's unusual, if it's not even unusual, but if it's unexpected. Like if there's just a new script, turn it off. That's basically what CSP is. That is not a true and um, security approach. That's it's kind of a fig leaf over the rest of it. And then as much of the workflow around automation should be should be excuse me, as much of the workflow around compliance should be automated as possible, meaning that there are a lot of ways to do this where it's just kind of like we put a bunch of tools in a toolbox and we use them sometimes, and that might make us secure or compliant. The compliance activity, any mature tool that you're using for this should be automated. Like it should be taking care of compliance tasks for you, rather than asking you to operationalize it. And so, what we view as an audit ready model, something that is prepared and good to go for an assessment, would be real time visibility into all the web pages in your website, not just the payment pages. And one more note on the whole site thing. It just occurred to me this morning, actually, is that in a lot of I spent a lot of time in web application development. It may actually be easier to do deployments and to implement solutions for a lot of people in a full site model rather than asking your developers, hey, can you do a bunch of stuff just on our payment pages? I know that sounds counterintuitive, like you're asking for more work in the full site model, but because of how websites work and are architected, a lot of times they can just put something everywhere much more easily, like in a general template, than to say, hey, scope this one piece of code or this one CSP or whatever to just this one web page. That is actually a more challenging task in depending on a bunch of engineering stuff. But that is often a more challenging task than saying, fix the entire website. So just something to consider there. And as you're looking at your security project, it's counterintuitive, but securing more stuff might actually be easier in terms of project completion. So anyway, real-time inventory of everything, real-time signals, generally speaking, I think should be the standard rather than the 7-day thing. I don't think that's a realistic way to make anything more secure. Active enforcement, meaning something that's going to block unauthorized scripts and block specific behaviors, not just turn something off if it doesn't match a whitelist, but actually control the behavior of scripts, I think is extremely important in any practically working solution. It also puts you in a much cleaner spot of saying, like, here's the general control, like philosophy, like here's what we're doing on our web pages to be actively secure, as opposed to like, here's why we wrote our CSP in some specific way, or et cetera. And then compliance reporting, I think this is probably pretty straightforward. Like this is what I would expect from any kind of off-the-shelf solution, is that the reporting is going to mesh up nicely with what my assessors expect and other things like that. And so some general kind of practical advice for your next assessment or your next audit. I know QSAs don't like it when we call these things audits, but I mean, what else are they? But they are assessments, not audits. So I think it's a good idea to get together. You can contact Source Defense about this. And Scott, maybe I can ask you for one more link to /free PCI. So you can contact us. You can contact me. I'm Matthew at sourcedefense.com. You can hit us at sourcedefense.com/free PCI. That'll let you get access to our platform at no cost and show you some info about your own stuff. And or also in terms of readiness assessment, certainly reach out to your QSA if you do that work, or any other kind of external source or even internal source for your ISA. They may be familiar with Source Defense already. I think we've spoken to something like 80% of the English-speaking QSA firms in the world. So if you're interested in kind of like how good are we going to be for our next assessment, I think that's a great way to do it. Take a look at the team, at the tools you've already implemented, or the tools that you're using to monitor those. So what I mean by that is we have unfortunately heard from a lot of folks who come to us, who ask us if they can who pursue us for a sales if they're trying to buy our solution. We hear a lot from them that like, oh, we thought we had something in place. We went to actually check it for the assessment and it wasn't implemented or wasn't doing what we expected it to do, or et cetera. So I know it sounds kind of superficial, but it's a good idea to check if the stuff that you implemented to pass your assessment last year is doing what you want it to do, and to, document anything that's going on there. And then think about getting a purpose-built solution, meaning that if you are using a DIY approach, like an internally developed or kind of solutionized way of doing this, kind of like what I said in the prior point, like do kind of a check in on that and see how it's going, and then kind of an honest inward looking assessment of the effort to keep that thing going and how effective it is versus an off the shelf solution. So I know I'm pushing pretty hard on the like vendor. It's a good idea to have a vendor. I'm a software vendor in this space, of course, but I do earnestly believe that a commercial off the shelf solution, because of the specific nature of this problem, because of the complexity of solving it, because of how fast you need to be to keep up with the changes to it, and because of how difficult it is to rely on something that can only run on a payment page, for all those reasons, I just think it's unrealistic for any company that's not a cybersecurity software company to do their own thing internally and expect it to check all the boxes and not just cause a bunch of other problems. So that's my general idea about commercial off-the-shelf software to solve for PCI DSS. So that is the end of my material for today's webinar. I am happy to answer any questions from the audience, to take any feedback, only positive feedback, please. I do have a very fragile ego, but I'm here and I'm an open book. Okay, right away I've got one here. So I'll paraphrase here. Do I have to do this if I'm an SAQA merchant? And this is like comes up a lot. So there were changes to the self-attestation questionnaire, version A, which is the kind of most lenient or most permissive version of how you can report on your PCI compliance. And what that was amended not too very long ago to say that, let's see, how did they change it? They quote unquote removed 643 and 1161. But what they added in its place was an eligibility criteria. And that means if you want to be able to fill out the SAQA, you have to say that your site is not susceptible to eSkimming attacks. So they replaced the specific recommendations from 643 and 1161 with with the general statement, your site needs to be not susceptible to attacks. So it's kind of a catch-22 where now you've wound up, if you want to keep using the SAQA, you need to attest to the fact that your site's not susceptible. How are you going to attest to that? Well, what a lot of QSAs are saying is that I don't have any other, the QSA has no other guidance to validate that the SAQ was appropriate. So they're just going to use 643 and 1161. So sometimes you hear that, oh, they removed these requirements from the SAQA. If I fill out an SAQA, I don't have to do it, which isn't the case. You just have to prove you're not susceptible, and you kind of either get to choose your own adventure around that, or, like I said, fall back on 643 and 1161 anyway. That's a good question. I want to thank everybody for their time and attention. There's lots of great links in the chat, lots of information for totally free, no obligation, some stuff if you want to talk to me and our team more deeply about what Source Defense does and maybe how we can help you. And I just want to say I'm grateful for your time today, and thank you.